All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to your Everything College Football Podcast. Today, Nick here. We're doing our first Bracketology episode of the college football season, a week away from the inaugural 12-team CFP rankings. We're going to go ahead and dive into our bracket and look at who's in the bubble, who's the favorites, and all that good jazz when it comes to this extended college football playoff. We'll start with the first four, the conference title favorites. Oregon firmly in control after beating Ohio State. They should be punching their ticket to Indianapolis with ease. Georgia, after a monster effort against Texas, bearing something unforeseen, they will also be walking into Atlanta with no problem. Things get a little hairy down below, though, Nick, with Clemson and Iowa State. These are the favorites I would say right now. I think that Clemson is a better football team than Miami. But there's a four-way tie right now in that conference, and then the Big 12 is a complete mess, as always. It's a very entertaining conference right now, but I think they're also the best team in that respective conference. What do you think of this first four right here? Obviously, this can change significantly, and Georgia and Oregon will be playing tough opponents, as will everybody in their conference championship games. So this could all change significantly. We could be 0-4 on this come the early December.
We could certainly get some of these wrong. I feel confident about a lot of these. I don't feel as confident about the Big 12. I'll discuss that in a second. Oregon, their pathway is pretty straightforward the rest of the season. They don't have a whole lot on the schedule. They have a trip to Michigan coming up, the Big House, this weekend. Obviously, tough to play there, but this Michigan team is not very good. I think Oregon handles them with ease. Then Maryland, at Wisconsin, then Washington to close out the season. Not a whole lot of worries there for me at all. I think the Ducks will easily secure the number one seed and continue to do so. Georgia coming off, they have their one loss against Alabama, which was an uncharacteristic performance for them in the first half. Really the only bad half of football that they've played the entire season. Outside of that, they've been lights out, and comes off of a huge win over Texas recently, where they won that game and played really strong in that one. They got a tougher schedule than most of the teams on this list. They have to play Florida this week in their big rivalry game. I think they'll win that game comfortably, but anything could certainly happen. Then they have a trip to Oxford, Mississippi to play Ole Miss, who have certainly fallen out of favor, but are still a very good team, plus playing Tennessee later in the year, a team that a lot of people are still very high on and still could potentially shake things up. So Georgia, they got a tough pathway going forward. The SEC is very top heavy, a lot of really talented teams at the top of this conference that are all punching each other. They got to play each other. The pathway is not very clear necessarily for this Georgia team going forward. When I look at Clemson here, I think they're the best team in the ACC. Miami, yes, they're a very good team. They are unbeaten, but Miami's gotten lucky the last couple of weeks. They've gotten bailed out in a couple of situations. Clemson has been playing really good football. I know Virginia scored 31 points on them, which is probably more than they were hoping to give up to Virginia, but that offense is firing on some solid cylinders. The schedule for Clemson is really solid, pretty easy the rest of the way forward. At Virginia Tech, Citadel, South Carolina. At Pitt, that's certainly an intriguing one. That could be a tougher matchup for them heading on the road to a really good jumpstart Pitt team that looks really good on offense this year. But Clemson, I think, should get the job done. Miami, they have a schedule coming forward that features easier games as well against Duke, Georgia Tech, Wake, and Syracuse. But I think eventually Clemson does get the nod when things are all said and done in the conference title game, and will win that conference title game. The Big 12, what a complete crazy chaos. I absolutely love it. BYU, Iowa State, both unbeaten at the top of their conference, while Kansas State and Colorado are right in the hunt as well. Colorado quietly having a great season with Deion's company, getting things done, while Kansas State is also a strong unit figuring things out. This Iowa State team has a big win over Iowa on the road, but the rest of the schedule has been pretty weak. They have not played a lot of great teams, and now they play Texas Tech, Kansas, Cincinnati, Utah, and then that big matchup with Kansas State to wrap out the regular season. This top four, I like it right now. A lot's going to change, obviously, as things goes on. These teams have a bunch of question marks across the board. I think Oregon's really the only one that feels penciled in at this moment in time. The rest, all up for grabs with the way these conferences are shaking out.
Now we'll go ahead and look at the open spot projections. 6 through 12, we'll start with Texas. They're going to play at Texas A&M, who you don't see in this bracket right now. I think that loss to Notre Dame in week 1 certainly holds plenty of weight because their strength of schedule isn't the greatest. I don't think a win over LSU, where they dominated in the second half, is just going to be enough to automatically put them into this top 12. Texas, though, in Texas A&M, again, they'll fight for that spot against Georgia and Atlanta, so those spots could easily be flipped. Go ahead and stick with the Horns right now, who, other than that blemish, have been pretty outstanding, even their strength of schedule certainly isn't the greatest. I think if Texas loses to the Aggies, Nick, and they drop one more, they will firmly be out of this top 12, and I don't think they'll be able to come back from that. Obviously, it will be the last game of the year, so I think for Texas, they're in a pretty vulnerable spot. I think, with Ohio State and Penn State, I think they're feeling pretty good. Penn State probably more than the Buckeyes, because if Ohio State loses this game, I don't think they'll miss the CFP. I just don't see the committee doing that exactly. But it's going to be a big blow, and it's going to be hard for them to get back into it as well. I think at the end of the day, even with 2 losses, the Buckeyes will be in there. But that's a major game as well for seeding purposes. I think Ohio State, we both picked them to get the job done against Penn State. And then, of course, we talked about Miami and a pretty weak schedule the rest of the way. I think they're firmly going to be into this playoff. I think Clemson's better for the sheer fact that the Miami defense, they've been allowing a lot of explosive plays this year. They didn't have much of a downfield passing attack against Florida State, and they showed that they can, be physical and run the ball. So I think that's certainly impressive. But will they be able to run the ball with that much ease against Clemson in the conference title game? I'm not convinced they will. So right now, Clemson has that nod. But what are your thoughts on some of those things I just mentioned about those 4 specific teams, Nick? Because again, I think Texas, they will be out of the playoff if they lose again.
Yeah, I'm going to start with Texas here. I think that's a very bold acclamation to say that a 2-loss Texas misses the playoffs considering their SEC team. But once you start to pick it apart, it's like, okay, maybe this does make a lot of sense. Key wins. They went to the road and beat Michigan in the Big House, but Michigan's falling apart. They're not even close to ranked anymore. That win's not aging that well. They lost to Georgia. That was a pretty bad loss. They beat Oklahoma, a team that's also, falling off very hard. They're 1-4 in the conference. That win's not aging very well either. They beat Vanderbilt on the road this past weekend, but that game was significantly close. It got really close towards the end there. That is a good win on the strength schedule, I'll give you that. But then when you look at it, Monroe, UTSA, Colorado, Mississippi State, not great results the rest of the way. The schedule, they got to play Florida, Arkansas, Kentucky. Those are all really not helping you a whole lot, especially getting Florida at home, not having to go to the Swamp. And then A&M, that's the big one, right? That's the huge one right there on the road. I think A&M, right now, A&M wins that game. I think A&M has all the energy in the world in a rivalry game. Of course, Texas was dodging A&M for years. The Aggie fans are fired up to get back at the Longhorns, a game that ended in a walk-off field goal the last time these two teams played. All eyes in college football will be certainly on that game on November 30th, which is getting closer, only a month away from that one. If Texas loses that one, I think it certainly starts to make the conversation about I think a lot of things would have to happen around college football to get them in. At 2 losses, leaving them out, I think that would really burn Longhorn fans. They would not be happy considering this team was the number 1 team in the country at points in the season. Curious to see how that shakes out. When I look at Penn State, Ohio State, the pathways I think are very interesting for the both of them. I really, am curious to see who comes out worse with a loss here, because Penn State, they got a pretty easy schedule after this Ohio State game. They play Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland. Certainly at Purdue can be a little tricky at times. We've seen Purdue upset some big value teams. Certainly one to keep an eye on. But Ohio State, the wild card for them is they got to play Indiana. That's an absolute wild card for me. Indiana, I think, is playing such a high level right now. Could they be potentially, on upset, or could they potentially beat Ohio State in Columbus? That would be a crazy, earth-shattering game. I think Ohio State beats Penn State right now. Penn State with 1 loss, they certainly get in, and the pathway for them to get in with 1 loss is very clear. I think they win all 4 of those games very comfortably. Don't know if they get to the Big Ten title game, because Indiana could be undefeated. Ohio State could get in as well with the tie-breaking win. Oregon will certainly get in. So I think Penn State, if they lose, they're kind of like feeling all right about it, because if they just sit where they are, they win out, they don't go to the title game, I think they're certainly in with 1 loss. That really sets the pathway up for them. So maybe it's not the worst thing in the world for the Nittany Lions to lose this weekend, all things considered, because they may not beat Oregon on a neutral field. That could be a really tough matchup for them and can cause some troubles later on the line, although they certainly do get in as well with a 1 loss in the conference title game. I think it makes a lot of sense with Miami, right? This Miami team is unbeaten, but I think this Miami team is very vulnerable. They've shown some weaknesses as of late, as I said previously in this episode. They concern me going down the stretch, so I don't mind having them at 8 right now. I think they'll find a way in with 1 loss if that's how it all shakes out, but they're a very vulnerable team, certainly a team to keep an eye on.
Some of the other teams we'll focus on here, it was pretty laughable to say that the Big 12 would have 2 teams. But right now, that's how it's looking. And I think if Iowa State and BYU both win out and they're undefeated, the loser of that game will still be in the playoff, I would say. They have a very nice win over SMU, does the Cougars, and they've been beating everybody pretty handily so far this year. They'll bring up their remaining schedule. As we look at Tennessee as well, a team that's certainly on the inside right now, but this is a team, since they've entered conference play, their offense has been no good, and obviously the committee is going to use fancy adjectives like excitement and whatnot when it comes to eye test and all that. And obviously they dominated a bunch of nobodies, but in conference play, offense has been no good. 14 in a loss against Arkansas, 25 against a good Oklahoma defense, but overall not a great team. Florida in overtime, not a great win, and they beat Alabama due to a phenomenal effort in the 4th quarter, but they got shut out in the first half of that game as well. So, this is a team that still plays at Vandy, at Georgia. It's likely Tennessee drops another game. That's another 10-2 team, Nick, that I just don't think is going to be impressive enough. If they're out here blowing out Florida and Arkansas and OU and whatnot, beat Bama a little bit better, I would say, no doubt about it. But when you play at number 2 Georgia, that's a game that you're probably going to lose. I think Tennessee will be knocked out of the hunt.
I think Tennessee is certainly in peril. They find themselves in the toughest position of the teams we're looking at right now. I think their pathway is extremely messy and there's a lot of tough games coming forward. They got to play at Georgia, at Vanderbilt. This team is legit now all of a sudden. Pavia is a legit quarterback, and that's a rivalry game, right? I think the Vanderbilt fans would love to beat Tennessee. I do expect Tennessee to show up at that game, though, and have a nice environment, but that's, Vanderbilt's not a pushover. They took Texas to the wire. They beat Alabama, obviously. That's a real deal Vanderbilt team, top 25 team in the country. I think Georgia in Athens will have no issues beating this Tennessee team. I don't think Tennessee is really that solid on offense. Their biggest problem is they start very slow. We've seen it with this team in the loss to Arkansas, the barely scrape by against Florida and Alabama. They start off very slow in the first half. This Georgia offense, I don't think is going to, lay off the gas early on. That was the biggest problem for Alabama. Alabama wasn't able to score a lot of points in the first half, only being up 7-0 at halftime. I could see Georgia being up 21, 24, 28-0 at halftime and really putting this game out of reach for Tennessee, despite the fact they play very strong in the second half. That's the sort of the way I feel about it. I think if Tennessee gets blown out by Georgia, there's no shot they get in with 2 losses. The resume just isn't that strong enough when you look at it. Yes, they beat Alabama, but their other wins, Oklahoma, NC State, those are 2 teams that were in the top 25 that have completely fallen out of it. Vanderbilt could be a top 25 win as well, but that could be a team that falls out as well. So they may have no current top 25 wins outside of Alabama once push comes to shove. That would certainly be a resume, in my opinion, that gets left out considering what A&M could do and what else could happen away it goes. BYU, they got a pretty clear path, in my opinion. Utah's a terrible team. Kansas, not very good. Arizona State, they definitely have some fighting punch. And Houston, they're a pretty bad team, despite the fact that they have gotten 2 conference wins more than probably people expected them to do this year. But I could see, BYU and Iowa State being unbeaten in the conference title game, and the loser would certainly have to get in with 1 loss just based off the way things shake out. This BYU team is playing phenomenal. They got that great win over SMU. They're certainly a team to keep an eye on. I think either them or Iowa State right now, I think that's a 50-50 toss-up who could win that conference title matchup. Both teams would get in my opinion, in that situation, though.
Yeah, Tennessee, they play great defense, so I think that'd be a fun team to watch in the playoffs. I think could certainly compete. It's not a team that you would want to face by any means. Talking about BYU, the remaining schedule isn't all that great. I think at Utah, that's a rivalry game. That can be very interesting, despite some injuries on offense plaguing the Utes and making them not a very competitive team. At Arizona State, they've been a very underrated team under Kenny Dillingham this year. So no cakewalks by any means, and I think for them, they have quality wins. The only losses for Kansas State and SMU were to this BYU team. Kansas State, they beat them pretty badly due to being able to force a lot of turnovers. And you look at Notre Dame. I think this is the team that's also a pretty significant wild card because they play their final game of the year will be at USC, a team that is not the greatest record, only 4-4, but every game they've lost was on the final play, Nick. So I think that's certainly not going to be an easy game for the Irish. One that is certainly going to be very iffy for them. Before that, though, they get FSU and Virginia. Those will be easy wins. They play Army at a neutral site. I think they'll blow at Army just like they did Navy. But at USC, Nick, it's going to be a very tough game. Despite having the most embarrassing loss of the year at home to NIU, they still have that win over Texas A&M on the road. Beat a pretty solid Louisville squad, and then of course Navy's a team that might win out this year, so they have quality wins. They've really taken care of business since losing to NIU, but obviously this is a team that loses one more, they'll firmly be out of the picture. So we're talking about a couple of teams here who are in the picture now, but come the end of November, there's 4 or 5 of them that might be on the outside looking in. That's what makes this so exciting.
This is the big thing where I disagree with you, Notre Dame. I think this NIU loss has to carry more weight than it currently does right now. I think a lot of people, I've seen a lot of conversation on social media, people debating of what this looks like. I've had some conversations with my own friends as well, and you and I have had conversations about it. That's a monumental loss, right? I cannot continue to understate they were 28-point favorites at home. They lost to a MAC team and looked absolutely atrocious. I know wins are important, and sure, traveling to Kyle Field, that's a very important win. The win over Navy was very impressive, but again, Service Academy's got to take it with a grain of salt. Same thing with Army. Right now, they probably do boat race Army at Yankee Stadium. Again, Service Academy take it with a grain of salt. USC, they're not a great team, but they're a great team on paper, having not a great season. The rest of the resume, Louisville, that's a nice win. Georgia Tech is a decent win as well, but Stanford, Purdue, Miami, Ohio, Florida State, these are all pretty terrible teams. Virginia, not the greatest team in the world either. That NIU loss is just really bothering me because I think that it's tough to really make a case that this team is the same team that lost NIU because they're playing phenomenal on offense. They're really turning things around. But at some point, you got to value, and the committee's got to look at bad loss and say, hey, this was a terrible loss. I don't really know how it's going to all shake out. I think if, they have one loss, they end up running the table right now, they got to be in. But it's going to be a tough case for me because I think A&M, could have the better resume, certainly has a better resume right now, in my opinion, than Notre Dame does. And they could have the better resume if they end up beating Texas, or even losing a close game to Texas, they could have the better resume, in my opinion. So it's going to come down to it. I think the first week, once we see where Notre Dame ends up, will kind of tell us what the committee feels. If the committee ranks them pretty high, then we obviously have an idea that they really like what they've seen out of Notre Dame. But if they rank Notre Dame low in the 11 to 10 to 11 range, then that starts to worry me about what Notre Dame's future looks like, how things shake out. They're the big wild card here, right? They're always going to be the big wild card with that independent status. What will it look like going forward? Certainly a team to keep an eye on with the schedule and what they got left on the table.
Yeah, and certainly this is a convo we had back in week 2 where they're automatically out of the playoffs, but they have not struggled one bit since then. Numerous double-figure victories against teams that are better than NIU, for quite frankly. And you talk about carrying weight. I think the win against A&M carries plenty of weight. If this team wins out and they go to Atlanta, it's probably the most impressive non-conference victory in college football. And it takes a lot of guts to schedule a road game against an SEC team, especially one that turns out to be very good, and one that I think they could potentially beat again if they rematch this Saturday, for example. So I think Notre Dame, certainly, it's not a great loss at all. It's very bad, and Marcus Freeman's had a couple of those. I don't think you should keep them out of the CFP if they went out, though, because the Army game, the USC game, that will be a little tough, even though the Army game, again, I think it's not the toughest of contests, even though it's a team that is ranked at the end of the day. Strength of schedule will matter a good abundance, Nick. And I'll just ask you, let's say just Notre Dame schedule Central Michigan week 1 instead, they beat them 45-0. Would that change your opinion at all? Because, they took the risk and they played that game against A&M and they won, but it wouldn't be more impressive if they just had a freebie week 1.
No, right now I think that's the only reason why they're in the conversation, because if they had played, Central Michigan or some random group of 5 team, insert some random MAC team and boat race them, I don't think they're in the conversation with one loss. I think they'd be out with one loss if they had played Central, Western, whoever you want to throw in there, Buffalo, I don't care. You can put somebody in there. I think they'd be out because they just would not have any juice. That A&M win is carrying so much juice right now, guts for them for scheduling it, but I still think that loss is just so heavy. You're 28-point favorites at home to a MAC team, and you go out and absolutely lay an egg and look terrible while doing it. That's got to mean something, in my opinion. That's got to really be – it should be an eliminator, really, but it can't be in this way this format's set up. That's a terrible loss. It's got to be valued by the committee as a bad loss. I'm very intrigued to see where they end up. I think it's a really crazy talking point and something that's going to be continued to discuss throughout the weeks because, it's just something you got to continue to talk about. This is a Notre Dame team that doesn't play in a conference, won't have a conference title game. They build their own schedule. They do what they want with it. They play a lot of neutral site games. They don't play a lot of true road games. A lot of that is all factoring into it. They're a very unique situation, and it really comes down to what the committee values, what that room thinks, and what they end up deciding on how they value neutral site versus true road games, versus a non-conference schedule. All that stuff is going to be laid down in this committee, and they're going to have a long discussion about what they want to do with Notre Dame. It's a very intriguing team that has no real clear answer on what it looks like going forward.
One thing that's a big factor for them is obviously everyone else beating up on each other. That's obviously one thing that's really helped them move back up into their position in the rankings. I quite frankly think Notre Dame is one of the top 12 teams in college football. Would you say that, Nick? Yes or no?
Yes, right now they're one of the top 12 teams in college football, but I think that could change as the season goes on. I think A&M could certainly jump them in that position.
And then the 12th seed Boise State. We'll talk more on the group of 5 here on our next slide. Looking at the bubble teams, these are teams that are all outside looking in, but all can firmly get back in the hunt. LSU, Alabama, that game I think will ultimately determine a top 12 ranking. The rest of the schedules are pretty simple for those two teams, so I think with all the other chaos that will unfold, Bama or LSU, the winner of that game in 2 weeks in Baton Rouge, should be able to punch their way into the CFP. Of course, you alluded to Indiana, Nick. This is a team that's clearly very good at football, but when it comes to strength of schedule, they don't really have that. And obviously, they're going to see some tough opponents like Ohio State. Michigan's on there. They're going to see some opportunities to get in, so they're on the bubble outside looking in right now. Blowing out Nebraska, I think, is something major for them. Other wins against Maryland, Northwestern, Charlotte, UCLA. These are just not impressive wins. I think the one against Washington certainly is with a backup quarterback at home. This defense has been playing tremendous. Offense has a nice supporting cast around them. So this is a team under Curt Cignetti. It is phenomenal. That Ohio State game will ultimately dictate it, and I don't think anyone's going to pull the trigger and pay them to beat the Buckeyes. So as one less Indiana team, though, Nick, that would be the biggest problem for an LSU or an Alabama, and specifically the Tide with 2 losses right now. LSU would have that as well. So I think that would be a very interesting convo, those 3 teams we have on the left, Nick.
Yeah, I think there's something you got to look at from these 3 teams. I think Alabama and LSU, that makes a lot of sense for me as a team that wins that game gets in, although it makes a little more sense for Alabama. I think the schedule is more clear because Alabama beat Georgia. That's the best loss or best win other than probably Georgia beating Texas, the best win now, but that's the second best win in the country that Alabama first half dominance was a very impressive showing in Tuscaloosa. I think if Alabama goes into Baton Rouge and beats LSU, they have to be in with 2 losses as long as they hold serve with the rest of their schedule, playing Mercer, Oklahoma, and Auburn. I think all games they can easily win. Specifically the FCS game, Iron Bowl is a little wonky, but it isn't Tuscaloosa this year. And Oklahoma, I just don't think it's a very good team, even though that's in Norman. I think if Alabama beats LSU, I think they hold serve and they get in with 2 losses. I just think you can't leave out a team that beat Georgia and has some other impressive wins, which would be the LSU win would be an impressive win as well. Plus losing to Tennessee, a good Tennessee team on the road, and looks a lot better than it did at the moment, lost to Vanderbilt on the schedule. LSU gets a little murkier. They lost to USC at a conference, certainly tough. They lost to A&M this past weekend, didn't look great in that fourth quarter. They got to play Vanderbilt, Oklahoma, and Florida the rest of the way, so some juice there potentially by beating Vanderbilt. They beat Ole Miss, but they've kind of played themselves totally out of the conversation. We're not even talking about Ole Miss, which really shows the direction that the Rebels have gone. I think the story for LSU is a lot tougher. I think LSU fans are certainly rooting for Indiana to lose because Indiana could really screw LSU. That's the team with 2 losses that would be in a lot of peril. Indiana, they're a team that they're that interesting wild card factor as well in terms of the teams in this group because their strength of schedule is bad. Charlotte, FIU, Western Illinois out of conference, garbage across the board, right? Doesn't really mean anything. They only have to play Ohio State in terms of the big dogs in the Big Ten regular season. That win over Nebraska was very impressive. The win over Washington was very impressive, but they played Maryland, Northwestern, and UCLA the rest of the way so far. Not good Big Ten teams. They have to play Michigan, Purdue, Michigan State, Purdue, bad teams, not great teams. Michigan not playing very well. Obviously at Ohio State, that's the big one. If they lose that one close and only have 1 loss when it's all said and done, I don't see how you leave them out, even though the schedule is kind of weak. I think they certainly get in over LSU in that situation. If you have Alabama versus Indiana in that situation, right, that's a coin flip. It really comes down to what they end up valuing, who has the better win. And in that situation, Alabama has the better win despite having 2 losses. I would not be the one wanting to make that decision. We saw Alabama get in controversially last year against Florida State as sort of that battle between 2 teams there. It would be a similar situation. People would say Bama bias. There would be a lot of conversation about that if the Tide got the nod. Certainly would be a crazy way this kind of all shakes out. Curious to see what happens here. Indiana, they're a team that they really can do a whole lot if they continue to put up good numbers and play Ohio State very close and keep that a one-score game throughout that contest in Columbus.
Yeah, you look at Texas A&M, I thought that was an impressive second half against LSU, but I don't think that one win will overpower them into the playoffs. We talked about the game against the Irish, so the rest of that, they struggled against Bowling Green, Arkansas, Mississippi State. These are all 10-point victories or less. The Missouri game was highly impressive, but obviously they're a terrible team. At South Carolina, it's going to be a tough challenge this Saturday. If they beat Texas, though, they'll be in the SEC title game. They'll be in the playoffs, so not much to talk about with the Aggies. That's going to be the formula for them. If they lose one of the more games, then they'll be out. So I think it's pretty simple for Texas A&M. There's a couple of wild cards here, though. Talked about all the chaos in the Big 12. Kansas State, they lost to BYU because they gifted them so many points. There's only one scoring drive of 40-plus yards for BYU in that game. That shows you how poor Kansas State was in terms of special teams and turnovers and all that. Kansas State, though, they have a firm path, I would say, because, they can play their way into the conference championship game. Sitting at 7-1, this is a team that still has Iowa State in the final game of the regular season. That's going to be a monumental game, one of the biggest in the history of the conference if both teams continue to win. And then, of course, Pitt and SMU. Pittsburgh, it's going to be tough. Potentially Ilya Holstein not playing this weekend against SMU. They do play Clemson, though, so they can certainly shake things up in an abundance of ways, and, they host them. And then SMU, they don't really have much of a schedule here. I expect them to win on Saturday. I don't know how the tiebreaker works, Nick. I don't really care if Clemson and Miami are the 2 undefeated teams and SMU is the 3rd. The ACC is going to make a house call. SMU will be left out, so it'll be a big convo to see if they should be into the college football playoff. I just don't think they'll have enough, even if 11 wins. What do you think about some of these teams we talked about, specifically Pitt, SMU, and KSU?
Yeah, first I want to talk about Kansas State. I think for them, right, the pathway is very clear. Beat Iowa State, you're in the playoff, right? They lose to Iowa State. I think they're all said and done. If they beat Iowa State, they go to the conference title game. I think they win a rematch against BYU personally because of, like you said, they gifted so many points based off of turnovers. That's the big game. I wouldn't want to go to Jack Trice Stadium in Ames, Iowa in late November, in a big game on a Saturday night. I think you're going to lose that game. Iowa State, that atmosphere when they're playing in a big game, that's a crazy atmosphere. Kansas State, I think, would struggle to win that game. Iowa State certainly is the favorite, in my opinion, in the driver's seat. But that's the pathway, right? Kansas State win out, go to Iowa State, win in Ames. I think you're in the playoff at that point in time. I think it's pretty straightforward. Same deal with Texas A&M. I think the pathway is pretty straightforward. Hold serve, win out, beat, and then go on to Texas, beat Texas, you're in, right? That's what it is. There's not getting in my opinion, without a conference title. If they lose to Texas and still get to play in the conference title game and then win that game, then obviously they're in. But if they have 2 losses and no conference title, I don't see A&M in. I just don't think it makes a lot of sense, considering they lost to Notre Dame, Texas. Although those are two good losses, they would both be at home. I think that certainly does play a factor into it as well. I think Texas A&M would be in a lot of trouble if they have two losses. For them, the pathway clear, win out, you're in. I think that's the best way to prove it for them. SMU, Pittsburgh are very interesting cases. SMU has that one loss to BYU, not a bad loss at all. Obviously, a pretty solid loss. They have the pathway going forward. They have a very easy schedule after Pitt. If they win against Pitt this weekend, BC, Virginia, Cal, they may benefit from not playing in a conference title at 11-1. They could potentially get in. I think if BYU continues to play well, maybe they get in with one loss. That would be a very interesting case study for the ACC. I do agree with your assessment, though. I don't see the ACC putting them in the conference title game. I don't know the tiebreakers, really. I don't think anyone knows the tiebreakers. I would think they would want to have their two biggest brands, Miami and Clemson, in the conference title game, but maybe SMU finds a way in with the tiebreakers. I don't know. Pitt without Holstein certainly worries me. Pitt has the tougher way out of all the teams we're talking about because they got to play Clemson. That's certainly not an easy draw, and they got to travel to Dallas, play SMU this weekend. If they beat SMU, then, right, all the cards are on the table for Pitt because even with a loss to Clemson, they've started to play themselves into a really good position and could find themselves being a spoiler when things are all said and done with the way this is shaking out. Very interesting here. These teams that we just talked about, these 7 teams, all have a lot to play for right now. They're all really in interesting positions here. A lot can be decided. And a lot of these teams in that 12, or that not the 12, but 11, 10, 9, and 8 situations could all be really nervous about what happens in some of these bigger games throughout down the stretch.
And now we'll go ahead and focus on the group of 5. And one thing I'll say about Ole Miss, we left them off the list. If they beat Georgia in a couple weeks, they'll probably be certainly in. They're not going to beat them, even though they have a great run defense. Their offense doesn't play good football at all. They don't care. So I don't think Ole Miss will be a contender one bit. Group of 5, UNLV, they're still in the hunt despite losing to Boise State. Hard-fought effort in Vegas this past Friday. Boise State, of course, the 12th seed right now. The Mountain West is certainly always a funky conference. They can lose any one of these games over the next week, and nobody would certainly be shocked. Ashton Gianti leading the way, though. This is going to be the favorite for the conference. If they rematch with UNLV and the Rebels win that game, I certainly think there'll be a very interesting discussion. That would open the door for the teams in the AAC, though. Boise State, their only loss was a 3-point game. They lost at the buzzer to number 1 Oregon on the road in a game they quite frankly outplayed them in. So I think that certainly will hold a lot of weight at the end of the day. We look at Navy. They lost a game badly to Notre Dame. The whole thing with Army will be interesting because that game is played after Selection Sunday. So if that becomes a topic, then that will be very interesting. I don't think it will. I think that the Mountain West will hold enough serve for that to probably be avoided. But I also think Tulane's the best team in the conference, and they do play Navy. So I think this will be put to bed, Nick. I think Tulane will end up playing Army, and that will be a ranked victory potentially for them because Army, they play Air Force, North Texas, UTSA, and of course the aforementioned Midshipmen, along with that game with Notre Dame. I think if this is an 11-win team for Army and Tulane beats them, it's going to be up to them in Boise State and potentially UNLV if they win that game. Those are the 3 teams I'm eyeing in on, and I think at the end of the day, Tulane and Boise State will be the teams vying for that G5 spot. Tulane's very underrated right now. No one's talking about them, but I think they're going to be firmly in the picture here soon.
The G5 conversation is really on 2 conferences, the American and the Mountain West. The rest of the G5 conferences don't have a leg, in my opinion, with the way this is shaking out. It's going to be a Mountain West team or an American team. I think the 5 teams that we just talked about there are the ones that you got to take a look at. And I'm going to throw a name in here that you didn't throw on this list, Memphis. They're playing themselves back in the conversation. They're 7-1 right now. They got a date with Tulane in New Orleans on the 28th of November. That's a huge game as well. Their one loss was to Navy in an absolute shootout a couple weeks ago. They also beat Florida State, even though Florida State's pretty bad. They beat Florida State out of conference. They have a nice win over South Florida, and they played North Texas probably a little closer than they would hope to. I think Memphis is still in the conversation, even though we didn't put them on this graphic. Just want to give a quick comment on them. When you look at the rest of it, right, Navy's lost Notre Dame. That's a tough loss for Navy. Certainly makes their conversation a little bit tougher. Same thing with Army. Army's going to play Notre Dame, probably going to face a similar fate in a few weeks, and that sort of changes that story a little bit. You had Tulane in the playoff in August. You were one of the only people in the world that really had that, and they have 2 losses, but they are playing really good football in terms of conference level, and those losses are to Power 4 teams, including one of the teams that is sitting right on this graphic that you're looking at in Kansas State. So that certainly is giving Tulane a lot of juice. They got that big matchup with Memphis coming up. That's a big game that could certainly be involved if Memphis wins out. They'll probably be ranked, and that will certainly add some juice to it. Boise State, they got the big leg up by beating UNLV, and they have the best loss of any group of 5 team by a country mile, losing to the number one team in the country by just 3 points really does help you out. And obviously, Ashton Janty plays a factor in this because people want to watch Janty play. I certainly think the committee is considering that as well in this all said and done. UNLV, they certainly have a chance still, but their pathway got a little bit tougher. They have a loss to Syracuse as well on the resume. Boise State looks to be the team right now. I think Boise State will be the team that gets in ultimately, but I could see Tulane or Memphis shaking this up as well. I think the Service Academy, sadly, as much as I love the story there, I think they're both out, although they do get a great consolation of playing each other in a rivalry game after the rest of the regular season is done, one of my favorite games of the year. UNLV, I think, has played themselves in a tough position as well. I don't think they're going to end up getting in. It's going to come down to Tulane, Memphis, or Boise State for me, and I think right now the Broncos have just shown enough to get the job done, but ultimately things will change throughout the rest of the last couple of weeks. Certainly keep an eye on the Mountain West and the American. These are two important conferences, the only two conferences in G5 that matter right now in terms of playoffs positioning. I like where these two conferences are heading. Going to come down the wire. Certainly going to be a great battle to the finish from these two conferences.
And the whole reason no one's talking about Tulane is because they started off 1-2, losing to Kansas State at home, a game they probably should have won. And then at Oklahoma, you should not be punished for scheduling tough out-of-conference opponents that nobody else has really done, other than service academies, of course. And like you said, that game against Memphis, that could carry a lot of weight as well. So final two games for them are two pretty tough opponents. You'll turn around and potentially face a ranked one in the conference title game. So I think it's going to be between them and Boise State, like what I've seen from the Green Wave so far this year. That's going to be it for this episode, Nick. As always, I appreciate you joining me, breaking down bracketology. This is obviously going to usually sort itself out as it always does.
Borrowing some name recognition from college basketball now that we have the 12-team playoff, you can get a little more fun, have a little more in-depth breakdown compared to the 14 playoff in the past. It will sort itself out. A lot of these teams got to play each other. There will be a lot of moving pieces. This bracket may look wildly different come a few weeks from now. Certainly fun to talk about the pathway, talk about the schedules going forward, and keep an eye on that G5 race. That G5 race between those two conferences is really exciting. I'm curious to see who ends up getting the nod in the end. If you have two teams with similar wins and losses, similar resumes, I wonder who ends up getting in the Mountain West or the American Athletic. A big bump to whichever one in the conference gets the first G5 spot in the playoff.
Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.